Let me quickly introduce our first speaker, Tabitha Gallo. Tabitha has over 25 combined years in cybersecurity, privacy, risk, and governance, with experience with global Fortune 100 organizations and multiple sectors, including payment card industry, healthcare, construction, manufacturing, oil and gas, and high-tech services. She brings a comprehensive set of options for clients to capitalize and improve upon strategic and operational solutions, supporting their governance, regulatory, and sustainability requirements. And Tabitha's talk for today is security assurance at speed.
My name is Tabitha. Thank you for the introduction, Brian. I really appreciate it. We're going to talk a little bit today about security assurance at speed, and this presentation is at speed. So from an agenda perspective, we're going to be looking at security assurance. What is it? How do we define that? What does it mean today versus what it didn't mean yesterday? Some frameworks. How do we implement frameworks in a way that we can actually assure that we're meeting them? And do they always work the way we think? Concepts of baselines and automation. How do we do a security assurance today with those types of automations? Can we? Can we adapt to the speed of business? Business is changing every day. So I'm going to start a little bit about security assurance. My role in security, or my path through life in security, was not an easy one. It was actually not even intended to be security. I originally started out as an engineer, civil, building roads and bridges, that type of thing, and worked into computer science and business. And then I went and worked for a very large multinational that said, let's put you in the audit because you have all these great skills. We're going to send you all over the world. We're going to make sure that you learn and see all of our environments. There was over 100,000 people in the organization. I had 100 business units with distinct things. And I was like, I learned so much. I learned how much I didn't know. And in this, it was like, let's go audit the IT. Let's go audit the accounting, the engineering systems. And you use the AICPA audit standards and the ISACA audit standards to get you there. And we really just learned that you didn't know enough. And you really knew that people could kind of snowball you because they would tell you one thing and you just didn't know enough to say, was that true or not? So you had to get picky. That was a good learning basis because I was lucky enough after my years as an auditor to be promoted into security assurance. And, back then, security assurance or a security assurance manager was considered somebody who was the poor guy who had to handle the RBAC systems, who had to do the training of people, who had to, with checklists and stuff, validate that certain things had been set up the way they're supposed to, or people told you that they'd set them up the way they were supposed to. And you had to make sure that the policies that the organization had carried out. And if something went wrong, you were always the person that they pointed to. Well, why didn't you tell us? Well, today those days are long gone because you really don't know who are your users. You don't know where your data sits. Your applications are kind of all over the place. Users could be employees, contractors, partners, partners of partners and customers. They could be government entities. The concept that we used to have when I was initially doing security assurance was, this is a castle and a moat. You're going to keep all the bad guys out. And you're going to have this barbican, otherwise known as a gate, with a portcullis, otherwise known as a firewall. And you're going to manage and make sure that those single points of entries or multiple single points of entries would be well managed, and you would only allow those people that you knew really should have access to your sacred data. Well, that's long gone. Today, you can't pull up the bridge. You can't even identify where those bridges are. So we have to kind of think things through a little differently. So really, how do you do security assurance? Our employees work at home, so it's no longer the responsibility of one person or one team to provide assurance. We've optimized our computing workloads. We have the best of breed SaaS systems. We are running data centers in clouds, or we're running clouds. We don't fully understand all of our partners and where our data may lie. So the new reality is security assurance has to be pervasive and has to be found throughout the organization. It needs to be built in every process, and it needs to be built into every system, even if that system's not yours. So how do you go about doing that? Well, you're going to hear zero trust. Everybody talks about zero trust these days. Microsoft lives by zero trust. And the guiding principle to zero trust is, hey, who and what is accessing your data and resources? Know who they are. Identify who they are. Verify explicitly who they are. And that is not just the person. That is the system. That is the computer, the device, figuring out where they're coming from. It is minimizing the access to only what is needed when it is needed. Now, this is not a new concept. Least privilege, i.e., has been around since, hey, way back when I first started in security engineering. So we just never got it right. And we ended up giving least privilege, and that least privilege stayed with that person. So if they had it, they, that least privilege being administrator access, they had that all the time. That's not how we can do it these days. Why? Because, hey, why does somebody have to have administrator at 12 o'clock midnight when they're actually not on the system? Why not just give them just in time when they need to use it if there's an issue? Because we really need to minimize the blast radius if somebody else is taking our identity and using the systems. So how do I make that assurance that they are who they are? You got to assume that you've been breached. Always think of your systems this way. And the only way you can do that is to provide policy and organizational policies and enforcement of those policies and have threat intelligence. You can't use a one person will fix all of this. So we're going to talk a little bit about those policies, how those policies work together. The concept of cybersecurity framework, we're going to talk about each kind of one that we have, big picture. It's a journey. We talk about controls, we talk about programs, we talk about risk. But there's no one size fits all in an organization, in a workload. It has to be adapted. So we talk about control frameworks. A control framework here it provides a baseline set of controls. It will assess your current technical state. It will prioritize your implementation control roadmap if you've defined what your objectives are for that workload or for that group or for that business unit. And it helps you to make sure that initial roadmap is correct. But if you just stay at that, you're not going to be flexible enough because things change. So an examples of a control framework would be like NIST SP 853, the CIS, or even ISO 27002. But again, this isn't enough to actually allow you to operate a good security and to ensure that you're going to have assurance. So you need some way to talk about this. And this is something called program frameworks. By the way, I did not invent this kind of breakdown. The guy who did made a really good presentation, and I've put it here for you to reference. He's got a whole 1 hour split as to why this works. In the program framework, we're talking about how do you assess the state of the overall cybersecurity program. So this is to speak to the executives. You're going to build a comprehensive program that's going to include things like governance, which really didn't exist in some of those control frameworks, the big pictures of how the glue works. You also measure it and you compare yourself in your industry, across industry, and you make sure that you're not spending too much building Fort Knox when you're only protecting your piggy bank. So you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing in the right area. And it helps simplify communications because let's be honest, how many times do you talk MFA and the executive go, why do I want to know about this? What does this mean? You want something that's a little bit more relatable at the executive level, and this helps you do it. So these program frameworks are like the NIST CSF. I love the NIST CSF You can talk to it across the board, and you can demonstrate in lovely picture diagrams maturity models. The ISO 27001 happens to be something that's international, but it's not as relatable. I tend to like better than this CSF. But that doesn't give us the whole meal deal. There's a concept of risk frameworks, which we absolutely have to build in, because not like, again, you don't want to spend too much if you're only, safeguarding a piggy bank versus Fort Knox. So let's talk about risk frameworks. In our risk framework, we're going to find our key process steps to assess and manage risk, i.e. the audits, the assurance, the processes that are repeatable. You're going to have a structure for risk management. You're going to have an accountability model, maybe delegations of authority, who can make what risk decisions. Can somebody make a decision at a lower level to, maybe not meet that regulatory requirement? Probably not. Continuous processes for improvements to identify, measure, and manage that risk, and to prioritize your security objectives and activities. Because again, while we said the control framework gave you your initial roadmap, it doesn't give you the bigger picture. These three things together will give you an overall good program. And these examples would be like NIST SP 853, FAIR, ISO 27005. Even if you're using COSO models, examples are things that would help you. But all over that, we also have industry-specific standards, things that we have to meet, regulations we have to meet, things like PCI DSS, ISO 27018. All of these are things that are important and fundamental to running our businesses. But we have to, get these things to work together. How do we put these into our policies? How do we fundamentally create those baselines? So the first thing we do is we outline those baselines in our framework and we align them to our business. But we have to acknowledge that in that governance aspect for making security assurance work is the governance. Making our policies, understanding what is it going to cost, structuring it so that we have the baselines. We then have to migrate that, rules out so that they're consistently done. We need to look at it from, how is it going to be the same if we do a web app to a virtual machine, or all of those nitpicky technical details. But we want to make sure that we do them consistently across the similar types of organizations. We want to make sure we secure it. We have to have a way of monitoring it and automating those lovely rollouts, making sure that we know when something hasn't been applied correctly and identify the alerts. So these are our ways of doing it. And in that, this is where we measure, hey, listen, do we have a threat? Are we meeting our baselines? Is there something that I need to change? Is there some way that we can see this all across the board? You need to think about those policies and frameworks that we talked about, those policies that we picked up. How are you going to be able to relate them to those frameworks? And then when we do this, we want to do this by writing code. We don't want to do this by one person picking things. Why? If we allow anybody to make those changes, we'll never have the assurance that what we designed, what we tested is being implemented consistently and consecutively the same way. So that gets us to the ability to adapt to the speed of business. So when we talk about going back to that original big picture, is how do I do from an assurance perspective in a very large business? How do I get to each one of my divisions? How do I ensure that I'm meeting their requirements, but that we can accurately say that we're secure, that the framework that we selected for that workload, for that business objective is being met? Well, we do it by building those foundational baselines that are layered based on the business unit, the regulatory obligations, and the workload type. We don't want to manage by exception by saying, hey, we have this one baseline that applies to everybody, but I have exception, exception, exception. That way, it really is not something that you can actually manage. You want to start building your baselines up so that the minimum baseline, it applies to everybody and there shouldn't be no exceptions. And then when you get to a PCI workload, you're applying the structure for PCI that is needed for that workload and that workload only. And you would have the additional controls for that environment. So it doesn't necessarily apply or give you exceptions across the board. And you do that through that organizational policy process. You also want to build security assurance upfront as part of your SDLC. And you're saying, well, why are you talking SDLC? Because I truly, fully believe that the only way you can get security assurance at speed that the business is doing business these days is by incorporating infrastructure as code, security as code, and that means that your infrastructure people, your applications people, even if it's on premise, have to really be coders. And they have to learn to follow the code processes for releases. They have to ensure that they have gates, security gates, that they have code reviews, and that their code is managed so that we actually can meet the requirements for the assurance before we release the product. And that means building in the apps, the infrastructure, and in the network. It also means using the CI/CD pipeline. So CI/CD being continuous integration, continuous development processes. And these are controlled through access control so that not anybody has access to make those changes. And that you have a DevSecOps automation that is going to actually push that code out and control when it can go. And it only gets released after it meets very secure gates that measures the quality and the security using static application, dynamic application, interactive application security testing, and ultimately, depending on web apps and things like that, runtime application self-protection. So these are things that you want to implement so that you have some automation in the process of ensuring for security assurance. You want to make sure that the assurance group is not considered a roadblock or a no organization. You really want to think about, how do I, in the business, become a way to reduce the risk to an acceptable level, but I'm a real partner with the business. And then consider implementing a bug bounty program. And this is why, because you're not going to be good enough. Somebody else is going to find it, and you want to know about it before it gets released, if possible. But across the board, you're always incorporating risk management. Finally, to wrap all of this up, and I did say it was at speed, the following. Security assurance requires the minimum number of policies necessary applied across the organization. You need to layer your policies for specific business units that may have requirements, tight requirements, or specific workloads. And then you want to measure them. You want to build security assurance into your processes, in your applications, your infrastructure, through secure code development. You want to have automated enforcement of those policies and alerting when you want to consider that. Like, for example, you say that people come in and you want to make sure those identities, you want to make sure that you know they're coming in from a computer that you've agreed. Those are things that you can use to put automated enforcement of policies. You want to do continuous monitoring and alerting, and you want to adjust and reconfigure your policies as things change or as you see the external behavior, the environment change. That's all I have to say, but I'm willing to take questions.